So let's come back to this second part of the day with a big discussion on how big corporations who have massively outsourced their productions 40 years ago without paying any attention to what was happening in their supply chain, discovered now that not only sometimes they have indeed cheap labor, but they can have also forced labor. And then it's very late in the play to analyze the supply chain, understand where this happens, and how to remediate. So it's a huge issue. 75% of human trafficking, as we know, happens in forced labor. So that is to say, in the supply chains of all corporations in the world. But before we do all that, I want you to know that we are live streaming the conference on Facebook, and the response from the global audience has been absolutely huge. A fourth panel, Privacy and Security with Cyrus Vance and Ken Ross, had 19,000 views, and we reached 500,000 people. The Stories of Survival panel that we just finished had 58,000 views with over 600,000 people reached. And we are trending on Twitter here in Washington, D.C. So it shows interest for the cause of human trafficking, which is a good thing. Let me now introduce you to someone who is remarkable. It's Cindy McCain. And I'm very grateful for her to come and speak here because we are going to listen what she has to say. As we know, she's a great advocate in the fight against human trafficking and slavery in the US. And Cindy McCain is co-chair of the Arizona Governor's Council on Human Trafficking, and she sits on the McCain Institute Human Trafficking Advisory Council. I had the pleasure to meet Cindy in London a few months ago, and I was extremely impressed by her personal passion and her commitment on the fight against slavery. Through her work, the McCain Institute, several strategic partnerships have been formed, helping grassroots and trafficking organizations and leading to the conviction of criminals. Cindy will address here a crucial issue, and I asked her to speak of that, is the role investors can and should play in the fight against slavery. Earlier this year, at a breakfast in Davos that the Thomson Reuters Foundation organized, we addressed the issue, and it was really interesting in this crowd of Davos to hear all these CEOs saying, you know, when we are in investors' meeting, never, never the word forced labor is mentioned. So why is it mentioned when you invest in a company? You look at money laundering, you look at many other issues like corruption, etc. Why don't you look at forced labor? So, Cindy, I'm delighted you come and you speak of that.
Monique, thank you very much for having me and our Dun & Bradstreet friends today. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm indeed, the past two panels that I've listened to have simply been amazing. What a great group you've put together here today on an issue that is, in my opinion, is gathering steam around the world right now. I'm really very excited to talk to you today about cleaning supply chains from forced labor. And it is my opinion, as I just mentioned, that we are in a perfect storm on this issue. People are beginning to talk about it. They're beginning to respond to it. They're talking about it in daily society. That's what we wanted, because now we can move in for the kill. We can fix this problem, in my opinion. This is an issue that I've been speaking about for a long time, but it is a basic human rights violation, period. And the rule of law is almost non-existent in it. It will come as no shock to anyone in this room that in every country on every continent, men, women, and children are trapped in jobs into which they are coerced or deceived and which they simply cannot leave. We heard an example of that earlier. Somewhere, right now, women and men are toiling in fields under threats of violence. Children are weaving textiles for very little or no pay. And men and boys are trapped in dangerous conditions on construction work sites. These are not workers, but labor victims, labor trafficking victims. They're victims. They're victims. They're not criminals. They're not there by their own volition. According to the ILO, 21 million people are victims of forced labor, with 90% of the cases occurring in the private sector. While there are undoubtedly deep connections to the illegal economy, workers are also exploited every day as part of legal global supply chains. We all know that modern global supply chains are complex and often opaque, but this does not absolve companies from working to ensure they identify, monitor, and prevent the use of forced labor in their operations and supply chains. New regulations such as the UK's Modern Slavery Act, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, and the EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive have highlighted the very real financial and reputational risks for companies with global supply chains. Failing to address forced labor issues can have a profound and widespread negative impact on a company's operations and the bottom line. These impacts include supply chain disruptions, financial penalties, legal and compliance issues, and significant reputational damage. Here's one concrete example. In 2015, the U.S. Marine Services Company, Signal International LLC, went bankrupt after having to pay $20 million in compensation to victims of forced labor, leaving two of the pension funds invested in the company with a loss of approximately $70 million. Increasingly, investors are recognizing that mismanagement on labor issues can be a good proxy for bad management and bad practices in general. This recognition has encouraged investors to push companies they hold to take action to mitigate their exposure on potential liability. Though there are many roles investors can play in encouraging companies to tackle forced labor risks, I will highlight only a few. First, major investors can and should conduct a risk assessment prior to engaging with or investing in any company. This process has been greatly aided by the work of organizations like Know the Chain and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Know the Chain, for example, is working to produce benchmarks for companies in various sectors on their efforts to address forced labor. Investors can also monitor allegations and incidents related to human rights abuses, as well as companies' responses on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center website. Next, investors can encourage companies to adopt business practices that minimize the risk and consider divesting from those that don't. Another form of investor engagement is raising or supporting shareholder resolutions on human rights issues. In 2015, human rights-related shareholder resolutions were raised with U.S. companies including Amazon, Expedia, Facebook, Sears Holdings, Kroger, Urban Outfitters, and Staples. Investors can also positively influence company behavior through collaborative engagement via established investor networks. I'll give you an example. The Responsible Sourcing Network established the Cotton Pledge guidelines for companies to avoid sourcing cotton from forced labor systems such as those in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. As a result of this initiative, which was supported by institutional investors, more than 200 companies committed not to sourcing cotton from Uzbekistan. Finally, for investors who want to be informed and take action on the issue, there are some great resources out there. Know the chain, subscribe to their newsletter, or joining groups like the United Nations-supported Principles for Responsible Investment and the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. By understanding the issue and the risks and engaging with companies, investors can and should play a critical role in ridding the world of this unconscionable and epidemic crime. Lastly, it is time, in my opinion, it is time that we as Americans should hold countries accountable for human rights violations. This means we start right here at home. We're not innocent on this. Although I have talked about the labor issues, I would be remiss in not mentioning, of course, the hundreds of thousands of women and children enslaved right here in the United States in sex trafficking today. These people are denied their basic human rights and their dignity. The children have been denied their childhood. No longer should we tolerate slavery of any kind. It is time that this country stop rewarding countries for bad behavior and stop rewarding companies for bad behavior. You can start in your local communities. In Arizona, we just passed a piece of new legislation that absolutely removes the word prostitute as it applies to a child. That's huge. It's huge. Children are not prostitutes. I believe we're the first in the country to do that. Customers, we should charge them for what they are: statutory rapists and child abusers. No more tickets for John schools, no more tickets or John schools in the place of prosecution. Jail time, jail time. Take an active role in ridding your neighborhoods of this horrific crime. No human being should ever be enslaved. No child should ever be without hope. Thank you. Thank you, Monique, for having me.
Thank you, Cindy. Very, very good.